She isn't fit to be queen. She never was. I only kept her close because it was convenient." The words landed in the marble corridor like stones dropped into still water, and Seraphine Valdris felt each one ripple through her body until her knees nearly buckled. She stood just beyond the arched doorway of the War Council chamber, one hand pressed flat against the cold stone, and she listened to the man she had bound her life to dismiss her as though she were a worn cloak he was finally ready to discard. The bond that had lived in her chest for 3 years, that warm, tethered thread that had connected her to Kael Draven, the Alpha King of Iron Hollow, did not snap gently. It tore. She felt it rip loose from somewhere behind her sternum, a phantom wound so vivid she nearly gasped aloud, and only years of swallowing her own pain kept her silent. Blood roared in her ears. The torchlight down the corridor swam, and still she did not move. She did not scream. She listened. "You truly mean it, then?" That second voice was softer, sweeter, laced with a satisfaction that made Seraphine's stomach turn to ice. It belonged to her own sister. Leora, younger by 2 years, golden where Seraphine was dark, adored by the court in a way Seraphine had never been. "You'll set her aside for me. I will do more than that." Kyle's voice was steady, certain, the voice of a king who had never once in his life doubted his own judgment. "The council already suspects her of feeding secrets to the Thornwild packs. The evidence is compelling. When it comes to light, no one will fault me for annulling the bond and taking a queen the people can trust. You've given me everything I need, Leora. You've been more loyal to this crown in 3 months than she was in 3 years." Seraphine's fingernails scraped against the stone. Secrets, the Thornwild packs, treason. She knew, with the terrible clarity that comes only in the moment a life ends, exactly what had happened. The intercepted letters found in her private study, the coded ledgers no one could explain. She had been baffled by them, wounded by the suspicion in Kyle's eyes over the last month, unable to understand how documents she had never written had appeared in her own locked drawers. Now she understood. Her sister had planted them. Her sister had built a gallows out of forged ink and whispered, "Poison," and the king, her mate, the man who had once held her face in his hands and sworn he would never let the world be cruel to her again, had bought every plank of it. She waited for the grief to arrive. It did, but it came wrapped in something colder and far more useful. Cold clarity, a stillness that settled over her like fresh snow over scorched earth. She had spent 3 years making herself small enough to fit inside the shape Kael wanted, folding away her sharpest instincts, her hardest questions, her own considerable mind, because a queen who thought too loudly made a king look weak. She had let them all believe she was soft, decorative, convenient. And in that belief, they had made a fatal mistake, though none of them knew it yet. "When?" Leora asked, and Seraphine heard the rustle of silk as her sister moved closer to the king. "When will you announce it?" "The tribunal convenes in 3 days. She'll be summoned to answer the charges. She won't be able to. And then it will be done." A pause, the scrape of a chair. "Send for her tonight. Let her spend her last nights in the Queen's chambers, thinking she is still loved. It costs us nothing, and it keeps her calm. It costs us nothing." Seraphine pressed her lips together until they went white. She peeled her hand from the stone, 1 finger at a time, and she stepped back into the shadow of the corridor without a single sound. The old Seraphine, the one who had wept into her pillow the night Kyle first looked at Leora a beat too long, That woman died quietly in the dark that evening, and no one in the War Council chamber heard her go. What rose in her place didn't weep. What rose in her place made a single silent vow, the kind that reframes an entire life in one breath. They think they are burying me, she thought, walking back toward the Queen's wing with a spine straighter than it had been in years. They will learn they only planted me deeper, and I have always grown best in the dark. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the edge of the vast bed she had shared with Kyle in the early years, before the distance crept in, before Leora arrived at court with her clever tongue and her borrowed warmth, and she made a list in her mind of everything she knew. She had not been idle in her 3 years as queen, whatever the court believed. While Kyle governed with the loud confidence of a man who had inherited his power, Seraphine had governed with the quiet attention of a woman who had earned every scrap of standing she possessed. She knew the treasury better than the treasurer. She knew which lords owed which debts, which trade routes bled coin and which fed it, which of the border packs kept their oaths and which merely pretended. She knew the true health of the kingdom in a way Kyle, who saw only maps and armies, never had. And she knew, because she had built it herself over long, careful months, a thing that no one, not Kyle, not Leora, not the council, suspected existed. There was a name she had used in the merchant guilds of the free city of Ashmere, a 2-day ride south, beyond the border of Iron Hollow's direct rule. A name that was not Seraphine Valdris, queen, but Myra Vale, a shrewd and reclusive investor who financed grain shipments and iron smelting and, quietly, a great many other things. She had begun it as a hedge in the first cold season after she realized her marriage was not the sanctuary she'd believed it to be. A woman with no power of her own is a woman who can be discarded, her grandmother had told her once, and Seraphine had never forgotten it. Under the name Mira Vael, she had squirreled away a fortune. Not stolen, she had never taken a coin that was not hers to take, but built, patiently, from the modest allowance a queen was permitted to invest, and from the returns she reinvested 12 times over. It had grown into something formidable, something that could buy freedom, and eventually, something more. When the pale grey of dawn crept across the floor, Seraphine rose and went to the small locked chest at the foot of the bed. Inside lay the crown jewels she was permitted to wear, the emerald circlet Kale had given her at their binding ceremony, the ring that marked her as queen. She did not touch them. She left them exactly where they lay, gleaming and cold, and belonging to a woman who no longer existed. Instead, she took only what was truly hers, a plain iron key, a leather folio of documents she had copied in her own careful hand, and a small pouch of coins minted in Ashmere, not Iron Hollow. She dressed in the simplest gown she owned, the one the laundress had nearly thrown away, and she pinned her dark hair back from her face and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. There was a knock at the door, soft, apologetic. She knew that knock. "Come in, Doran," she said. The old steward entered, stooped and grey, the man who had served the Queen's household since before Seraphine had arrived, the man who had taught her which servants could be trusted and which reported to the council, the man who had once, years ago, quietly moved a poisoned goblet away from her plate at a feast without ever saying a word about who had placed it there. Doran Hale had seen 4 queens come and go in this castle. He had seen the way this one worked, in the small hours over the ledgers, and he had never once mistaken her silence for stupidity. His eyes found the untouched jewel chest, then the plain gown, then her face, and understanding passed over his features like a shadow. "So," he said quietly, "you heard." "I heard everything." Seraphine's voice did not shake. "The tribunal is in 3 days. My sister planted the letters. The king believes them because he wants to." She let the words sit between them, plain and terrible. "I am not staying to be convicted of a crime I did not commit, Doran. I am leaving before they can lock the cage." The old man was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, worn at the creases as though he had carried it a long time waiting for this day. "The southern postern gate," he said. "The night guard is my nephew's boy. He owes me a debt he can never fully repay, and he will let you through without a word if you carry this. There's a cart of spoiled grain going out to be buried at dawn. No one searches a cart of rot." He pressed the paper into her hand, and his fingers, gnarled and warm, closed briefly over hers. "You were the only one of them who ever thanked me by name, my lady. The only one who saw the people in this castle as people. Whatever you're going to build out there, and I know you're going to build something, you build it well. And when the day comes that it stands taller than these walls, you remember who held the door." Seraphine's throat tightened, and for the first time since she had heard those words in the corridor, she felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. Not for Cale, not for Leora, for this, for the small, stubborn loyalty of a man the court considered beneath notice. "I'll remember," she said. "I'll remember all of it." The severing came at the postern gate in the raw cold of that first light, when the young guard, Doran's grand-nephew, a boy with frightened, honest eyes, lifted the bar and swung the small iron door open onto the world beyond the castle wall. Seraphine climbed into the cart among the sacks of ruined grain, and as she settled into the sour-smelling dark and the driver clucked the horse forward, she felt the last thread of her old life pull taut and then release. The bond to Cale had already torn. This was something else. This was the moment the girl who had come to Iron Hollow as a hopeful bride finally let go of the castle that had swallowed her whole. She did not look back at the towers. She had already memorized every stone of them, and she had no intention of ever again seeing them from below. The road south to Ashmere was long and rutted and grey. Seraphine walked most of it, having parted from the grain cart at the first crossroads with a coin pressed into the driver's palm and a warning to forget he had ever carried a passenger. She kept her hood up and her pace steady, and she let the miles put distance between her body and the place where her name had been poisoned. She did not weep on the road. There would be time for that later, and even then she would ration it carefully, because grief was a luxury, and she had a great deal of work to do. Instead, she thought. She turned the puzzle of her ruin over and over in her mind, examining it from every angle, and the more she examined it, the more certain she became that Leora had not acted alone. Her sister was clever, yes, Seraphine had never underestimated her, but Leora was clever in the way of a person who knows how to be charming, how to whisper, how to make a man believe a flattering lie. Forging ledgers that could fool the king's own auditors, arranging correspondence that referenced real Thornwild movements with real dates and real names, that required knowledge Leora didn't have. Someone had given her the tools, someone with access to the kingdom's intelligence, someone who wanted Seraphine gone for reasons that had nothing to do with a girl's jealousy over a crown. By the time the walls of Ashmere rose out of the southern haze, honey-coloured and busy with the smoke of 100 forges, Seraphine had stopped being a discarded queen fleeing her execution and had become something else entirely. She had become a problem to be solved, and Seraphine Valdris had never in her life met a problem she could not solve, given time and silence and the freedom to think. 6 months later, in a high room above the grain exchange of Ashmere, a woman named Moira Vael sat at a broad table of dark wood and quietly held the throat of the southern trade in her 2 capable hands. She wore no crown. She wore a merchant's coat of deep green wool, well cut but unornamented, and her dark hair was pinned back in a style that spoke of a woman with better things to do than be looked at. Ledgers surrounded her, but she barely consulted them. The numbers lived in her head, arranged and cross-indexed, with an ease that made the exchange's most seasoned brokers uneasy. In 6 months, she had gone from a wealthy anonymous investor to the single most influential financier in Ashmere, and no one could quite say how it had happened, only that when Moira Vael decided a shipment would move, it moved, and when she decided a lord's credit had run dry, doors closed all across the free city as though a wind had blown through them. The transformation was total, and yet nothing about it was false. This was who Seraphine had always been, beneath the folded-away version of herself she had presented at court. Sharp, decisive, comfortable with power in the way only a person who has learned to wield it quietly can be. The difference now was that no one required her to hide it. In Ashmere, competence was the only currency that mattered, and she had more of it than anyone. She had walked into the grain exchange a stranger, and within a month had cornered the winter grain market so precisely that 3 noble houses of Iron Hollow, houses that had once dined at her table and never bothered to learn her opinions, found themselves paying her prices without ever knowing whose purse they filled. "You're doing the thing again," said a dry voice from the doorway. "The thing where you stare at the middle distance and quietly ruin someone's year." Seraphine looked up. Corwin Ashcroft leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, a half-eaten apple in one hand, and an expression of long-suffering amusement on his weathered face. He was the master of the Ashmere Exchange, a man of perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair, and the kind of practical intelligence that had built the free city into what it was. He had taken one look at Moira Vael on the day she arrived, listened to her speak for 10 minutes about the coming grain shortage, and promptly torn up his own projections. He did not know her true name. He did not care. He respected exactly one thing in another human being, and that was the ability to be right when it counted. And by that measure, he had decided within an hour that she was the most valuable person he had ever met. "Rowan of Hallowmere," Seraphine said, tapping a page. "His credit is overextended. He's borrowed against a spring harvest that isn't coming, because the Thornwild raids have his tenants fleeing north. He'll default in 6 weeks and try to hide it by selling his iron rights. When he does, I want to be the one holding the note." Corwin whistled low and bit his apple. "You'd own a quarter of the eastern ore." He studied her with the frank curiosity of a man who had given up trying to pry into her past. "You know, most people who come to Ashmere with a broken life behind them, they spend the first year drinking or grieving or plotting some hot-blooded revenge. You spent it building an empire out of grain futures. Whoever hurt you must be very, very sorry by now." Seraphine's mouth curved, but there was no warmth in it. "They don't know yet," she said. "That's the best part." She had made herself a rule in those first raw weeks. No cheap revenge, no poisoned wine sent back up the road to the castle, no anonymous letters, no petty sabotage that would satisfy the wound for a single afternoon and then leave it gaping. She had watched too many wronged people burn themselves down for the momentary pleasure of scorching their enemy, and she had promised herself she would not be one of them. She would not play Leora's game with Leora's weapons. She would build something so large, so solid, so undeniable that when the reckoning came, and it would come, it would arrive not as a scream in the night, but as a door quietly closing, a debt quietly called, a truth quietly walking into a room. She would let them destroy themselves. All she had to do was make certain the ground was ready to swallow them when they fell. And they were falling. The intelligence reached her steadily now, carried on the trade winds, along with the grain and the iron and the gossip that flowed through every free city like blood through a body. Iron Hollow was rotting, the reports were consistent, and they were grim. Kyle had married Leora 6 weeks after the tribunal, a tribunal that had, in Seraphine's absence, convicted her in absentia of treason and pronounced a sentence of death should she ever return, a detail that Seraphine had received with the flat calm of a woman reading a weather report. He had made Leora his queen in a lavish ceremony that had drained the treasury Seraphine had so carefully husbanded. And Leora, it turned out, was a spectacularly poor queen. She had no head for governance, no patience for the tedious work of keeping a kingdom fed and defended, no instinct for the small mercies that kept a court loyal. She spent. She feasted. She elevated flatterers and exiled honest counselors who bored her. And the Thornwild packs, sensing weakness, had begun to press the eastern border in earnest, no longer content with raids, but massing now for something larger. "There's a man asking about you in the lower market," Corwin said one afternoon, and something in his tone made Seraphine set down her pen. "Old fellow, stooped, asking merchants if they know a lady investor, dark-haired, came to the city about half a year back. He's careful about it. Not the sort of careful that means trouble. The sort that means fear." Seraphine's heart, so long disciplined, gave a single hard beat. "Describe his hands," she said. Corwin frowned but obliged. "Gnarled. Old. A burn scar on the left, from a candle or a brand, I couldn't say." "Doran." She was on her feet before she had decided to move. "Bring him up," she said, quietly. "And Corwin, thank you." She caught the flicker of surprise on his face. She rarely thanked anyone, not because she was ungrateful, but because she had learned that, in the wrong world, gratitude was read as weakness. But some debts a person paid regardless of the world they lived in, and the man climbing the exchange stairs a few minutes later had held a door for her, when holding it could have cost him his life. Doran Hale looked 10 years older than he had 6 months ago. He came into the high room, leaning on a cane he had not carried before, and when his eyes found Seraphine, standing tall and unbroken and clearly, gloriously alive, his weathered face crumpled with a relief so profound that he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. "My lady," he whispered, "I told myself you were alive. I told myself every night. But to see it, sit, Doran." She crossed to him, took his arm, guided him into the chair with a gentleness she showed almost no one anymore. "You've come a long way for an old man with a bad hip, Corwin. Water and something to eat, please." She waited until the door closed and they were alone, and then she knelt beside the chair so that her eyes were level with his. "Tell me, all of it. You didn't ride 2 days on that hip to bring me happy news." He drank the water Corwin brought, his hands trembling around the cup, and then he told her. The kingdom was worse than the trade winds had reported, far worse. Leora's spending had emptied the coffers so thoroughly that the eastern garrisons had gone 3 months without pay, and unpaid soldiers do not fight well, or sometimes at all. The Thornwild packs had taken 2 border holdings already, and the king's response had been to blame his commanders and execute one of them as an example, which had done nothing but convince the rest that loyalty to Kale was a fast road to the headsman. The harvest had failed in the northern provinces, and there was no grain reserve to draw on, because the woman who had always kept those reserves stocked was gone. The people who had once eaten from that reserve in hard winters now went hungry, and hungry people remember who used to feed them. "They speak of you," Doran said, his voice low, "in the villages. They don't dare in the castle, but out where the crown can't hear, they say the old queen never let a child starve. They say things went bad the day she left. Some of them have started to wonder whether the treason was ever real at all." Seraphine absorbed this in silence, her expression unreadable. "And the king?" "Changed," Doran said. "Hard. He drinks more than he did. He and Queen Leora quarrel. The whole castle hears it. She wanted a crown, and now she has one, and it's crushing her. And she hasn't the wit to save herself, so she does what she's always done. She finds someone to blame." His jaw tightened. "There's a man, my lady, come to court about 4 months back. Calls himself Lord Vareth of the Ember Reach, though no one had heard of the Ember Reach before he arrived. He's got the king's ear now, more than the council does. He whispers, and Kyle listens. And the more Kyle listens, the worse things get. It was Vareth who pushed to execute the commander. It was Vareth who convinced the king to raise the grain tax right when the people were starving." Doran leaned forward, and his frightened old eyes fixed on hers. "My lady, I've served that castle 40 years. I know the smell of a man who's steering a ship onto the rocks on purpose. Lord Vareth wants Iron Hollow to fall. I'd stake my life on it. And I think he was the one who gave your sister the tools to ruin you. Because you were the only one left in that castle who'd have seen what he was." There it was. The shape she had suspected on the long road south, finally given a name. Leora had been a knife, but someone else had held the hilt, and that someone had needed Seraphine gone not out of jealousy, but out of strategy. Because a queen who knew the treasury better than the treasurer, who could read a forged ledger at a glance, who watched the border packs with a merchant's eye for patterns, was the single greatest threat to a man who intended to hollow the kingdom out from within and hand its carcass to its enemies. She had thought, all these months, that she had been the victim of a small betrayal. She now understood she had been the first casualty of a large one. Her removal had not been the whole plot. It had merely been the opening move. "Vareth of the Ember Reach," she said softly, testing the name like a coin between her teeth. "There is no Ember Reach, Doran. Not on any map. Not in any charter. Not in any tax roll in the southern kingdoms. I would know. I've read them all." She rose slowly, and something in her posture changed. The merchant folded away, and beneath it stood the queen who had governed in the small hours while a careless king slept, which means the name is a lie, and a lie that careful is a name someone is hiding behind. A man who invents a homeland invents it, because his true one would give him away. She turned to the window, where the honey-coloured roofs of Ashmere sprawled toward the southern hills, and beyond them, invisible, the border of the Thornwild lands. The Thornwild packs are not raiding for cattle anymore. They're taking holdings, coordinating. That takes a mind at the top, a strategist who understands Iron Hollow's weaknesses from the inside. She let the pieces fall together in the silence, and when they landed with the soft finality of a lock engaging. He isn't advising the king to ruin Iron Hollow by accident, Doran. He's advising the king while advising the Thornwild how to conquer it. Lord Vareth is their man. He always was. And Kael let him walk right through the front gate, because the one person who would have stopped him at the door had already been branded a traitor and driven out. Doran's face had gone grey. then it's worse than I feared. It's exactly as bad as I planned for, Seraphine said, and for the first time there was steel in her voice that had nothing to do with grief. Rest here tonight. You'll not go back to that castle. Not yet. And not the way you came. She summoned Corwin, arranged a room, saw the old man settled with a care that surprised the exchange master, who had never seen her fuss over anyone. And then, alone in the high room, as the sun went down over the free city, Seraphine Valdris sat at her broad, dark table and began at last to build the endgame. She did not act rashly. That was the discipline that had carried her through 6 months of patient construction, and she did not abandon it now that the target had come into focus. Over the following weeks, she gathered quietly, the way she gathered everything, through the trade winds, through the ledgers, through the vast web of obligations she had woven across the southern kingdoms. She sent trusted factors to make discreet inquiries into the origins of a man matching Lord Vareth's description. She cross-referenced the dates of Thornwild movements against the dates of Vareth's arrival at court, against the dates of Iron Hollow's most damaging policy decisions, and the correlations were so precise they might as well have been signed. She found, in the records of an Ashmere counting house that had once done business with the Thornwild before the raid soured trade, a payment scheduled to a man called Vareth Colm, a Thornwild war captain who had vanished from their records 4 months before he appeared at Kael's court under an invented title. She had him. She had all of it, laid out in documents so clean and so damning that no council in the world could look at them and cling to the fiction of Seraphine's treason. But documents alone would not be enough. She knew Kyle. She had loved him once, and even now, hollowed of that love, she understood him better than he understood himself. He was a proud man, and proud men do not accept salvation from the people they have wronged. If she simply sent the evidence north, Kyle would suspect a trick, would see the hand of the traitor queen behind it, would perhaps even destroy the proof out of sheer wounded pride. No, he would have to be brought to the truth in a way that left him no room to reject it. He would have to be made to need her, to come to her, on his knees, without knowing whose feet he knelt at. And then, only then, would she let the truth walk into the room on its own 2 legs. The opportunity arrived, as she had known it eventually must, in the form of a desperate act by a drowning man. Iron Hollow's treasury was empty, its garrisons unpaid, its people starving, and the Thornwild were 3 weeks from the capital. Kyle needed grain and gold, and both immediately, and there was only one power in the southern reaches with enough of both to save him. The great financial concern that controlled the Ashmere exchange, the concern whose invisible mistress had, over the past half-year, quietly acquired the debts of half the noble houses of Iron Hollow. He did not know her name. He knew only that a syndicate operating out of the Free City held the last line of credit that could keep his kingdom from collapsing, and that its terms were negotiated in person in Ashmere by a woman the brokers called simply the Veil. "He's coming himself," Corwin reported, disbelieving, one grey morning. "The AlphaKing of Iron Hollow, riding 2 days south with a small guard to beg a loan off a merchant. Either the man's out of options or he's out of his mind." He studied Seraphine's face, which had gone very still. "You knew he'd come." "I made certain there was nowhere else for him to go," she said. Over the past 3 weeks, she had closed every other door with the patience of a woman locking up a house for the night. The other lenders of the Free Cities had all, one by one, declined Iron Hollow's approaches, some out of genuine caution, and some because the Vael had made it quietly clear that anyone who financed Kael Dreven would find their own credit in the southern markets mysteriously curtailed. She had not needed to threaten. She had merely needed to let it be understood. And so, with every other path sealed, the king had been funneled toward the single lender who would receive him, exactly as water is funneled toward the one open channel. "Prepare the receiving room," she said. "The good one, with the high chair and the tall windows. Have the guard admit him and his party, take their weapons as is customary, and seat them to wait." She paused. "And Corwin, when he arrives, don't tell him anything about the veil. Let him wonder. Let him wait." Cael Draven arrived in Ashmere on a cold, bright afternoon, 3 days later, and Seraphine watched him ride through the lower market from behind the gauze of her high window, unseen. He looked older. The confidence that had once radiated from him like heat from a forge had banked into something harder and more brittle, the bearing of a man carrying a weight he did not know how to set down. His guard was small, 4 riders where once he would have travelled with 40, and their harness was worn, their horses thin. The great AlphaKing of Ironhollow had come to the Free City looking like exactly what he was, a man at the end of his rope, reaching for the only hand still extended, without the faintest idea that the hand belonged to the woman he had condemned to death. She let him wait a long time. Not out of cruelty, or not only out of cruelty, but because a man who waits begins to bargain with himself, begins to lower his own price, begins to prepare to accept terms he would have scorned an hour before. She sat in the high room above, while below, in the receiving chamber, the AlphaKing of Ironhollow paced and drank the water he was offered, and stared at the closed door through which his salvation would, eventually, come. And while he waited, Seraphine dressed. Not as Myra Vael, not in the merchant's green wool. She went to the cedar chest in the corner of her chambers and lifted out a gown she had commissioned in secret 2 months ago, when the shape of this day had first become clear to her, a gown the deep, dark blue of the Valdris house colours, cut with the severe elegance of a woman who has no need to soften anything about herself. She pinned her dark hair up in the old style, the Queen's style, and she took from the chest a single ornament. Not a crown, for she had left her crown on a pillow in a castle she would never enter again, but a plain circlet of southern silver she had made for herself, a queen's mark for a queen who had crowned herself through 6 months of labour rather than a marriage. She looked at the woman in the mirror, and the woman looked back, and neither of them flinched. When she finally descended, it was not through the door Kyle watched. She entered through a side passage into the shadowed rear of the receiving chamber, where a tall carved chair sat with its high back turned toward the room so that whoever occupied it faced the far wall. She settled into it silently. She heard Kyle's pacing stop. She heard the small sounds of a man straightening himself, composing his face, preparing to beg with as much dignity as he could gather. "You are the Veil?" His voice. After 6 months, it landed in her ears and found the old familiar grooves, and she was distantly surprised to feel nothing but a cold, clean attentiveness. "I was told the Syndicate's principal would receive me. I have come a long way, and my kingdom's need is urgent. I'll be direct. Ironhollow requires grain and gold, and I am prepared to pay generously for both." Seraphine did not turn the chair. "Not yet. Generously," she repeated, and she pitched her voice low and even, giving him nothing to recognize. "Your kingdom is 3 weeks from the Thornwild. Your treasury is a dry well, and your garrisons haven't been paid since the leaves turned. What exactly do you imagine you have to pay generously with?" A pause. She heard the flush of anger he suppressed, the old pride bridling, and then, painfully, submitting. "I have the resources of the crown. You have the debts of the crown," she corrected, mildly. "I hold a great many of them. The note on Hallowmere, the obligations of the houses of Fenwick and Marn and Aldous, the mortgage on your Eastern Ore rights, which your own Lord Vareth was so eager for you to pledge." She let the name land, and she felt the ripple of it cross the room. "So let us not pretend this is a negotiation between equals, Your Majesty. It is not. It is a supplication. You have come to ask me to save a kingdom you allowed to be gutted. Before I decide whether it can be saved, I would like to understand how a strong kingdom became a beggar in 6 short months." "That is not your concern." His voice had gone tight. "I came for terms. Not a lecture from a merchant who has never governed anything larger than a ledger." And there it was. The arrogance, undimmed even in ruin. The reflexive certainty that anyone who worked with numbers instead of armies must be his inferior. It was the same contempt that had let him dismiss his own queen as decorative, and hearing it now, unchanged, burned away the last thin thread of pity Seraphine might have felt for him. She rose from the chair, and she turned it, slowly, so that the high carved back swung away, and the tall windows lit her full in the face, and she looked at Kael Draven for the first time in 6 months, and watched the colour drain from his skin like wine spilled from a cup. "You're right," she said. "I have never governed anything as large as a kingdom. A beat. I only kept one alive for 3 years while its king took the credit." The silence in the receiving chamber was absolute. Kyle's mouth opened and produced no sound. He took a step back, and his hand went to the empty place at his hip where a sword should have been, and was not, because the guard had taken it at the door, and the small, helpless motion told her everything about the state of the man before her. He had ridden 2 days to beg a loan from a stranger, and the stranger was the wife he had condemned to death, standing before him, crowned in silver, holding his kingdom's every debt in her 2 hands. "Seraphine!" Her name came out of him, cracked and disbelieving. "You're the tribunal. You're supposed to be dead," she supplied, and her voice was so calm it was almost gentle. "Executed for treason, on the strength of letters I never wrote and ledgers I never kept." "Yes, that was the plan. My sister planted the evidence. You bought it, and then you rode south 6 months later to ask the woman you sentenced to death for the money to clean up the ruin you made without her." She let that settle, and she watched it settle, watched it break over him in waves as his mind raced to reconcile the reality before him with the story he had told himself. "Sit down, Kyle. You look unwell, and we have a great deal to discuss." He did not sit. He stared at her, and something moved behind his eyes. The first stirrings, she thought, of a horror that had nothing to do with his empty treasury and everything to do with the slow dawning of what he had thrown away. "The evidence was compelling," he said, and even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded. The council saw what they were shown." She crossed to the broad table where she had, that morning, laid out the true reckoning. "You want to talk about compelling evidence, Your Majesty? Let me show you some." She turned the first document toward him. Payment records from the Ashmere counting house of Bellwether and Sons. Regular sums, paid over 11 months, to a man called Vareth Colm, a Thornwild war captain. You'll notice the payment stop 4 months ago. The same month a mysterious Lord Vareth of the Ember Reach appeared at your court and began advising you into the ground. She laid down the second. The Ember Reach doesn't exist. Here are the charters and tax rolls of every barony, march, and holding in the southern kingdoms. Find it. I'll wait. She laid down the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, each one a nail. The dates of the Thorn Wild advances, matched against the dates of your Lord Vareth's council. Every time he whispered in your ear, the packs moved to exploit exactly the weakness he'd just talked you into creating. He convinced you to execute Commander Aldrich, your best border general, and the packs took Stonewatch within the week. He convinced you to raise the grain tax when your people were starving, and half your eastern villages emptied, which is why your garrisons have no recruits, and your fields have no hands. He is not your advisor, Kyle. He is their general. He has been dismantling your kingdom from inside your own war room, and he began by removing the one person who would have seen him for what he was on the day he walked through your gate. He needed me gone, so he gave my sister the tools to ruin me, and he let your pride do the rest. Kyle had gone very still, and his eyes moved over the documents with the dawning comprehension of a man watching a flood rise past the windows of a house he cannot leave. He was not stupid. That had never been his flaw. His flaw was that he had never learned to doubt his own certainty, and now certainty after certainty was dissolving before him, and Seraphine could see the exact moment the full architecture of his ruin became visible to him. The moment he understood that he had not merely lost a queen, but had, in casting her out, handed his enemy the keys to everything. His hand came down slowly on the edge of the table, as though he needed it to hold himself upright. "How long?" he said hoarsely. "Have you known?" "About Vareth? 3 weeks." She gathered the documents back into their leather folio with unhurried hands. "About my sister, from the first night. I stood in the corridor outside the War Council and heard you tell her I was never fit to be queen. I heard you say you'd kept me close because it was convenient. I heard you plan to let me spend my last nights thinking I was loved, because it cost you nothing." She said it without heat, which made it worse, and she watched the words land on him one by one and saw him remember saying them. "So no, Your Majesty, I have not spent 6 months grieving you. I have spent them building the thing that is standing in front of you now. I let you drive me out, because a woman with no power of her own is a woman who can be discarded. And then I made certain I would never be that woman again. Seraphine!" He reached for her, an old instinct, his hand lifting toward her face the way it had 100 times in the early years, and she stepped back so cleanly that his hand hung in the air between them, foolish and unwanted, before he let it fall. "That doesn't work on me anymore," she said quietly. "None of it does. Not the hand, not the voice, not the name. You spent them. They're gone." She turned toward the tall windows, where the light of the free city poured in gold and indifferent, and for a moment she let him look at her back, at the straight, unbroken line of her, at the silver circlet she had made for herself, glinting in the afternoon sun. "You came here to buy grain and gold. You cannot buy them. But I am going to give them to you anyway, because there are eastern villages full of children who never wronged me, and I will not let them starve to punish their king. Doran Hale is upstairs. Yes, that Doran, the steward you never once learned the name of, who rode 2 days on a ruined hip to find me. He will attest to everything I've told you, and when you ride north, you will ride with the proof of what Vareth is, and you will deal with him before he opens your gates to the Thorn Wild in the night. That is my gift, and it is the last thing I will ever give you freely." Cale's jaw worked, pride and terror, and something that might, in a better man, have been the beginnings of grief warred across his face. "And your terms," he said. "There are always terms. What do you want in return?" Seraphine turned back to face him, and now, at last, she let a small, cold smile touch her mouth. "The grain and the gold are a gift," she said. "The terms are for something else." She drew from the folio a final document, this one heavy with the seals of 3 free cities and the signatures of a dozen noble houses whose debts she held. "You will sign this. It is a charter establishing the free city of Ashmere and the southern reaches as a sovereign trade dominion, independent of the crown of Iron Hollow, with all its debts to me forgiven in exchange for that independence. The houses of Fenwick, Marne, Aldous, and Hallowmere have already agreed. Their signatures are there beside the space left for yours. They would rather owe their loyalty to a woman who kept them solvent than to a king who bankrupted them." She set it before him, and the pen beside it, and she watched him read it, watched him understand that she was not asking for revenge, but for something far larger and far more permanent. "You will lose a quarter of your kingdom, Kale, the wealthiest, most productive quarter, but you will keep the rest, and you will keep your people fed, and you will keep your throne long enough to root out the traitor who's been sawing through its legs. Or you can refuse and ride home with nothing and watch Vareth finish what he started. The choice, as it always was, is yours. I've simply made certain that this time it's an honest one." For a long moment, the Alpha King of Iron Hollow stood over the charter that would carve away the richest lands he ruled, and Seraphine watched the man she had once loved take the true measure of what he had lost. Not the grain, not the gold, not even the quarter of a kingdom, but the mind that would have kept all of it whole had he only valued it while it was his. His hand shook as he took up the pen. "You would have saved it all," he said, very low. "If I had trusted you, if I had listened, you would have caught him at the gate, and none of this would have—" He stopped, because there was nothing at the end of that sentence but ruin, and he knew it. He signed. The pen scratched across the vellum in the silence, and with it a quarter of Iron Hollow passed forever out of his hands, and into the keeping of the Queen he had thrown away. "You built the gallows," Seraphine said softly, taking the signed charter and rolling it closed. "I only bought the lumber back at a fair price." He looked at her then, truly looked, and whatever he had come south expecting to find, it was not this. Not a woman who had outgrown him so completely that his kingdom's fate had become a matter she could resolve before supper. "Come back," he said, and it broke out of him raw, the last card of a man who had run out of every other play. "Not as... I know I have no right, but you were the best of that castle, the best of all of us. Come back and I will make it right. I will set Leora aside. I will name you queen again before the whole court, and let them all know the truth of what was done to you." No. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You still don't understand, even now. I don't want the crown you took from me, Kyle. I have a better one. I made it myself, and no council can vote it away, and no king can annul it, and no sister can whisper it out from under me." She touched the silver circlet at her brow, and her eyes, when they met his, held not hatred but something worse for him. Something like pity. "You offer me back the cage and call it a rescue. I climbed out of that cage 6 months ago. Why on earth would I climb back in? The door at the rear of the chamber opened then, on cue, and Doran Hale came through it, leaning on his cane, and behind him came Corwin Ashcroft, with a small honor guard of the Exchange's own men, and the message was unmistakable. The audience was over. Kyle Draven, Alpha King of Iron Hollow, had been received, weighed, saved, and dismissed, all in the space of a single afternoon, by the wife he had condemned. He gathered the leather folio of evidence she pressed into his hands, and he stood a moment longer looking at her, and then he did the thing that no one who had ever known him would have believed him capable of. He knelt. Slowly, stiffly, the proud king went down on one knee on the stone floor of a merchant's receiving room, and he bowed his head to the woman he had discarded, and he said, "Forgive me," in a voice that had finally, far too late, learned how to mean it. Seraphine looked down at the bent neck of the man who had once held her whole world in his careless hands, and she felt the last of the wound close over, clean and quiet. "No," she said, gently. "But I wish you well. Go home, Kyle. Save your people. Try, this once, to be worthy of them." She turned away before he rose, and she did not watch him go. Word of what happened at Ashmere travelled north on the trade winds faster than Cale's own horses. He rode home with the proof and the grain that Seraphine's factors sent behind him in a train of wagons, and what he did with them was, in the end, the one decent thing he managed in the whole sorry affair. He confronted Vareth in open council, the counting-house records laid bare before the assembled lords, and the traitor, seeing the game revealed, made the mistake of reaching for the dagger he still carried where the king's own had been surrendered at Ashmere's door. He did not reach it. The border commanders whose brother officer he had gotten executed saw to that. Vareth Colm died on the floor of the war room he had used to gut a kingdom, and the Thornwild advance, its inside man gone and its plans exposed, faltered and stalled at the border it had thought to cross unopposed. Iron Hollow held. Diminished, humbled, a quarter smaller and immeasurably wiser. But it held. Leora did not. When the truth of Vareth came out, so too came the truth of the forged letters and the planted ledgers, because a traitor's schemes rarely unravel in isolation, and the war captain had kept his own records of the tools he had provided, and to whom? The court that had crowned the Golden Sister turned on her with the swiftness of people eager to forget they were ever fooled. She was stripped of the crown she had ruined herself to obtain. And Kyle, perhaps because he could not bear to condemn one sister to the death he had nearly given the other, or perhaps simply because he no longer had the stomach for it, did not execute her. He exiled her. She left Iron Hollow in a plain cart, much like the one Seraphine had fled in, though Leora fled with far more escort and far less dignity, and where she went afterward, the trade winds did not bother to report, because a discarded schemer is of interest to no one, and the free cities had a new and far more compelling story to tell. That story was of a woman who had walked out of a castle in a laundress's cast-off gown and walked back into history as the sovereign of the southern reaches. Ashmere flourished under the dominion Seraphine built, and the charter Kyle had signed in that receiving room became the foundation of a trade republic that would outlast every crown that had ever looked down on it. She never married again, though Corwin Ashcroft remained at her side for the rest of his years, first as her partner in the exchange, and then, in the plain, undramatic way of two people who respected each other above all else, as something more, a companionship built on competence rather than conquest, on being seen rather than being owned. She fed the eastern villages through 3 hard winters. She kept Doran Hale in comfort and honor until the old steward died in a warm bed with the sun on his face, and she was the one who closed his eyes, and she buried him beneath a stone that read, in letters anyone could read, he held the door. She saw Kyle only once more, years later, when he came south not as a beggar, but as a neighbor, to sign a treaty of trade between his shrunken kingdom and her thriving republic, and they conducted their business across a broad table like the 2 rulers they had become, correct and cool and finished. He had aged into something quieter and, she thought, better than the man who had dismissed her in a corridor a lifetime ago. He asked her once, at the end, whether she had ever loved him. She considered the question with the honesty she gave everything now. "Yes," she said, "the girl who came to your castle loved you very much. But you didn't want her love, Kyle. You wanted her convenience, and the woman she became doesn't have any convenience left to give." He nodded, as though he had expected exactly that answer, and he signed the treaty, and he went home, and she watched from her high window as his small, honest escort rode north through the golden roofs, and she felt nothing but the mild fondness one feels for a chapter long since closed. And this is the thing worth carrying away from all of it, the thing that woman learned in the corridor and proved in the receiving room and lived out across every year that followed. Worth is not a gift that the powerful bestow upon you, to be granted with a marriage and revoked with a whisper. It was never theirs to give in the first place. They can crown you and they can cast you out. They can call you fit or unfit, convenient or expendable, and none of it touches the truth of what you actually are, because the truth of what you are is built, slowly and quietly, and often in the dark, out of every choice you make when no one is watching and no one believes you can. Seraphine Valdris did not defeat a king with an army. She defeated him by being, all along, exactly what he had failed to see, and by refusing, when the whole world told her she was nothing, to believe the world instead of herself. The cruelest people in your life will hand you your own destruction and call it your fault. And sometimes the only revenge that matters is to take the pieces they meant to bury you with and use them to build something they can never take away. So if this story moved something in you, if you felt that corridor go cold, if you stood a little straighter when she turned that chair around, then do something with that feeling before it fades. Give this video a like, because it tells the story it deserves to reach further. Share it with someone in your life who has been made to feel convenient, expendable, less than they are, someone who needs the reminder that being discarded is not the same as being finished. And subscribe, because this is what we do here, week after week. We tell the stories of the people the world underestimated, right up until the moment they turned the chair around. Then tell me, down in the comments, what was the exact line that gave you chills the moment you knew Kyle had lost her for good? I read them all, and I promise you, the people in that comment section understand precisely what you felt. Because we have all, at one time or another, stood in a cold corridor and heard someone decide we were nothing. And every single one of us has the same choice she did. Stay small, or grow, quietly, in the dark, until the day we walk back in.